Greetings and welcome to the pod. My name is Mark West. Heather Massey is a senior lecturer in the Extreme Environments Research Group at the University of Portsmouth. Heather has done extensive work into the human response to cold water, both the physical and mental effects, and her areas of research include thermal, altitude, and survival physiology. She's also an amazing ocean swimmer, having swum the English Channel and around Jersey, among other things, and has a podcast called Humans in Extremes, interviewing extraordinary guests who have done extraordinary activities in extreme environmental conditions. I started by asking Heather if she'd always been an ocean swimmer.
Well, I've been swimming since I was a kid, and my dad had a little dinghy when we were younger, and we were always climbing in and out of it. And he taught us to sail. And because we were going a bit further offshore, he wanted to make sure that we could swim. So we just always swum really, and got a bit bored by being in the pool all the time and thought, well, actually, I want to be outdoors, swimming or sailing. So that's where my love of swimming's really come from, is just my parents really, and their outdoor activities.
And have you always lived near the coast?
Yeah, for the majority of my life, I have. I used to live in the northwest of England, very close to Liverpool, and there were some local beaches and rivers there that we used to sail and swim in. I moved away to Loughborough, which is very in the centre of the UK, for a couple of years to do a degree, and then moved back down to Portsmouth on the south coast of the UK, which is right by a beach. So I'm really fortunate that I've been able to swim outdoors for the vast majority of my life, really.
I know that a lot of your work is in cold water. Do you call yourself a cold water swimmer? I mean, the ocean's never that warm in the UK, I wouldn't imagine.
Um, I don't cold water swim. I'm an outdoor swimmer. Um, I don't really sort of pigeonhole myself into any particular type of swimmer. I just like to swim outdoors, uh, preferably in water that's less than a normal pool. But it doesn't have to be ice cold. It doesn't have to be cold or cool. It's just outdoors.
And now you work in the Extreme Environments Laboratory, which is like that's a pretty cool name for a lab. What's that all about?
Yeah, it's a pretty cool name. Well, basically, we work in the area of what happens to people's bodies when they get hot, cold, or low in oxygen, primarily, and we just study the body, the physiology of the body in those environments, um, and that's kind of where we get the name extreme environments from, is that yeah, that we go to extremes of heat and extremes of cold and extremes of altitude. So we kind of thought calling ourselves the mildly uncomfortable lab was a little bit inappropriate, so we had to go a little bit further than that.
And you've done a lot of work on the effect of cold water on humans and like really cold ice water on humans. Maybe if we go through it, what happens when you first get into really cold water?
Okay, so when we initially go into cold water, we start to develop something called the cold shock response. And that results from rapidly cooling the skin. And that cold shock response involves that hyperventilation, that rapid breathing, and inspiratory gasp that you get immediately as you go into the cold water. So you'll immediately go and then start to hyperventilate a little bit. That also increases your heart rate and blood pressure as well. So in someone that's healthy, it's mildly uncomfortable and can make you panic a little bit if you aren't used to that experience. But in people with underlying conditions, some cardiac conditions, some heart conditions, um, those responses can be could be fatal. So we really try to study what the effects this response has on the body on initial immersion.
Is there a temperature where that kicks in? Does it only happen at really low temperatures, or is there some sort of graduated response?
It's really a graduated response, and it peaks at about 10 to 15 degree water temperature. But we still see people that experience the cold shock response at about 20 degrees. So that's just, well, it's about 4 or 5 degrees colder than normal pool temperature. And once you get beyond the 10 degree, below 10 degrees in terms of water temperature, you're going to maximally experience that cold shock response. Now, there are people who've been in cold water repeatedly that will have a much reduced cold shock response. So it's a response that you can, what we call, habituate or get used to. And that response is driven both physiologically by the body, just in terms of reduced heart rate, reduced inspiratory gasp and rapid breathing, but also you come to recognize that this response is going to happen to you, and so psychologically you're more prepared for it. So it becomes easier to cope with.
So the panic associated with it is a big part of the problem with the cold shock response, is it?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of research in this area, and particularly if you are anxious, you can actually exacerbate the cold shock response and also prolong it as well. And conversely, if you are prepared for that cold shock response, you can lessen that cold shock response because of that preparedness. So there are things you can do, sort of psychological skills training, to make yourself more prepared for going into cold water. And part of that is what cold water swimmers do all the time, is that they know that this cold shock response is going to happen. They recognize it and realize that it's not a threat. And so that cold shock response is able to diminish, whereas actually panicking, if you don't recognize that response, can actually exacerbate the response itself.
So is it, I guess it highly depends on circumstance, but is it better to acclimatize yourself before getting into the water? Take your time to get in which case you're exposing your body to even more cold, especially if it's really cold, that's probably not very good for you. Or is it better to just jump in?
From a safety point of view, it's always better to go in slower and in a controlled fashion rather than jumping into cold water, because that inspiratory gasp that you get on immersion in cold water, that it can be that inspiratory gasp can be 2, 3, possibly 4 liters, depending on the size of the body. If you're a big, tall person, then you're going to have a bigger lung volume, so you're going to be inspiring more air. If your airway is not above water, if your airway is below water level and you take that inspiratory gasp, that's going to fill your lungs with water, and that could precipitate drowning. So it's really important that you have that inspiratory gasp and also the rapid breathing response while your airway is clear of the water. So we always say, from a safety perspective, to go in slowly, go in a controlled fashion, get over that rapid breathing so that you're able to talk in full sentences before you start swimming. Just really from a safety perspective, that we don't want to encourage people to be diving into cold water and causing people to have problems as a consequence.
So what are some of the other things that happen to your body when you're in cold water, and I guess it gets worse the colder you get?
Yeah, okay. So we've got over that cold shock response. And if you stay in the water for a little bit longer, you'll actually feel fine. You'll feel quite normal. You'll be able to swim, talk to people in full sentences quite coherently. But as you gradually extend that period of time in the water, you're going to go from cooling the skin to cooling the superficial nerves and muscles. And as that starts to happen, you'll start to experience stiffness in the joints and fingers, and then eventually within the arms as well, which might mean that you're not able to properly coordinate a swimming stroke. Quite often swimmers talk about claw hand, where their fingers start to splay or they're unable to move their hands very well to orientate their swimming stroke. And that can really start to lead to something called swim failure. And that can start to mean that you go from swimming in a very efficient, effective manner to swimming, almost trying to swim vertically. And in someone that's not able to maintain their airway above the water level, that again is not going to be a good outcome for them. So that's a potential problem. And so what a lot of outdoor swimmers do is they do tend to be a little bit more well developed in terms of having a little bit of body fat, and that body fat will help to insulate that those muscles and nerves which are very close to the surface of the skin, particularly in the arms, and that will help to prevent or reduce the rate of cooling that's occurring in those areas. So that should help to prevent things like that swim failure from occurring.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you might end up going a bit vertical, and then that also just compounds the problem because you're much less efficient.
Yeah.
You're in the water for longer.
Yeah, yeah. You obviously the more vertical you get, the more drag you create, so that the less effective your strokes are going to be, and you'll start to fatigue very quickly because the muscles are very cold. And if you're unable to coordinate a swim stroke to keep your head above water, that can have some that can cause drowning.
And so under your nice extra layer of fat, I guess you still need to be pretty strong, don't you? Because you want to hold your stroke together.
Yeah, definitely. You still need to be very strong, but having cold muscles will reduce the strength, the power that those muscles can create. So being strong is good, but be aware that actually getting into that position where you are developing cold muscles will mean that even if you are a strong person, doesn't mean that you'll be able to maintain a good enough swimming stroke. So it's having that awareness that you are becoming cold is absolutely key.
I like this. So if you're training for a cold water swim and you've got half an hour, you shouldn't go to the gym. You should go and have a milkshake. This is your expert advice.
I think there is a reason why a lot of outdoor swimmers have a little bit of extra body fat, and that is primarily because it's very helpful to have that extra insulating layer.
And mentally, I hear stories of I'm not quite sure what the word would be, but just maybe not trusting what a swimmer is saying about themselves. Can a swimmer trust their own body in these situations?
That's a very good point you make. And we've done a little bit of research into this, and particularly looking at prolonged cold water swims, where not only we get skin cooling, we get muscle cooling, but we get deep body cooling. And we regularly monitor deep body temperature whilst we're doing these cold swims, and we ask the swimmers how cold they feel. And when they're getting to the point where we would withdraw them because of their deep body temperature being too cold, they're still saying they're comfortable. And so for us, that's a big warning sign that actually swimmers are not very aware of how cold they're getting.
And so, let's say now you're warming up. What should you do when you're warming up, and what's the after drop?
Okay, so if I deal with the after drop first, so the after drop is continued cooling once you've exited the water. Now, the reason for that after drop or continued cooling is the fact that while you were in the water, you were exercising and you were producing heat. And that heat was offsetting the rate of cooling that was occurring because of being in cold water. Now, the tissues of your body are still cold when you get out of the cold water, but you've actually stopped that heat production from the exercise. So the reason you have that after drop or continued cooling is because you still have all of that cooling stimulus occurring and none of the heat production from the exercise. So you carry on cooling to the point where your rewarming method is having an impact. So it's really important when you get out of cold water to get shelter, get dry, and change into warm and dry clothes as quickly as you can. And the method of rewarming, there are numbers of different methods of rewarming, some of which I would people away from, and some which would be preferred. And I say this quite deliberately because when lots of people start to talk about the comfort of being in a jacuzzi or spa bath, a warm spa bath when they've been in cold water, it's clearly very comforting and can rewarm you very quickly. Um, and we use those methods to rewarm people, but we are also measuring deep body temperature as well. And there are some issues with rewarming collapse that can occur if you rewarm someone too quickly using hot tubs or warm water spas. So we recommend that you get dry, dressed, and changed, and do some light exercise to increase that internal heat production that's occurring.
That's really interesting. So this would occur not just in really cold water, but I guess technically in any water that's less than body temperature. So this is something you should possibly be aware of, even if you're just having a swim at the beach on the weekend.
Yeah, it depends how long you're in for. If you're getting to the point where your deep body temperature is starting to cool, yeah, you want to make sure that you get get changed and into warm, dry clothing, uh, and not be tempted to go into the hot tub just because of that potential for a rewarming collapse. And it's not just it's not necessarily it's more about the trauma that occurs when you faint, that can be a particular problem as well. So we know that when you go into a hot tub, your body is cold and all the blood is very in the center of your body. Now, as you rewarm in that hot tub, what's happening is you're going to have your blood is then going to be moved to the periphery of the body. And that's fine while you're in the hot tub, because the hot tub, the water, the squeeze of the water while you're in the hot tub is maintaining your blood pressure. But as soon as you stand up out of that hot tub, and so you're going from an environment where your blood pressure is being supported by the water, um, and you're also quite horizontal. You're going to a vertical position where you don't have that water squeeze to protect your blood pressure, and there's a potential there for you to faint. And it's what happens to you when you faint that's particularly problematic in terms of traumatic injury. That's why we suggest that people don't go in hot tubs.
What's the coldest you've swum in?
I've done an ice K, and
Wow.
I went to the second World Ice Swimming Champs, which were held in Austria. What, 3, 4 years ago? So, and the coldest water, that was really cold. The water was 2 degrees, and the air temperature was -14. So it's actually warmer in the water, which was bizarre. Um, yeah, but the coldest I've swum in is zero point 0.2, and yeah, didn't really enjoy that.
No, I don't imagine so. So how did you feel? Did you? I imagine it takes longer to swim a K in water of that temperature than it does just in normal environments. How did you feel?
Much longer to swim a K in cold water than it would be normally because of the fatigue that's caused by the rapid cooling of the muscles. I felt dreadful. I felt absolutely awful, and I have no ambition to do an ice K based on how I felt from that. So absolutely no ambition. But it was really interesting to see the variability in people's response to being in ice cold water, from people that really suffered far worse than I did to people that barely looked like they'd been in cold water. So it was really quite an interesting, from a scientist point of view, it was quite an interesting observation to make.
You must have loved that. It's
Yeah, I
excellent
just
data
wish that I
collection.
hadn't been swimming and I could have just been taking everybody's temperatures just to see what it was like.
And so we've talked about some of these tough effects, but there's certainly a lot of anecdotal stories about cold water being good for you. You hear stories coming out of Scandinavia, people jumping into cold water, or the therapeutic effects of cold water. And I know that that's a big part of some of your work. Uh, how much truth is there to that?
Well, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there are therapeutic effects of swimming in cold water. And I think at the moment, that is the level of evidence, the scientific evidence that we're at. It doesn't mean that people have not benefited. What it means is that science has not caught up yet and the studies have not been done. So we have a case study that we've reported on where a lady with quite severe depression actually went through a coached season of open water swimming, and gradually she was able to reduce her medication for depression. It's a case study, it's a reported case study, and there are a number of different people who have also case studies of different medical conditions as well. So we know of someone with Crohn's, we know of people with migraine attacks that have also said that they've benefited from outdoor swimming or cold water swimming. And it's not that it doesn't happen, we just don't have the science or the rigor of the research behind it to find out, is this going to happen in lots of people? Is this a one-off? And what was the cause of that? Was it the cold water itself? Was it the group people were with? Was it the challenge? Was it the goal setting that went on? Was it the having a cup of coffee or tea with a piece of cake afterwards and a chat that helped? We don't know what the cause of any change was at the moment.
I guess in some sense, a lot of mental health is a physical thing as well, but it's really interesting how it can affect physical and mental health in this way.
Yeah, definitely. Some forms of depression are inflammatory based, and not all forms of depression are, but some are. And there has been some working hypotheses around the fact that cold water immersion may be used to reduce inflammatory responses, and if you then precipitate that out, if we immerse somebody in cold water that has an inflammatory form of depression and we can reduce that inflammation, then in theory the depression may be reduced or the depressive symptoms may be reduced. But this is all very hypothetical at the moment.
It's interesting, and I guess you can see a path to treatment there. I mean, cold water might be more fun than Voltaren, but there are medical treatments for anti-inflammatories or for inflammatory issues.
Yes, that there are medical treatments that have a very high level of scientific rigor behind them, some of which has been published, some of which hasn't. And we're not at that level yet. We have what we'd say the very basic level, which is anecdotal reports, which we're starting to accumulate into some research looking at those anecdotal reports. What we then need to do are those exploratory studies, which look at getting people that have a particular condition we think might benefit, getting them through outdoor swimming programs. And then we can start to build up those randomized control trials, which are the highest level of, or one of the higher levels of research design. And quite a lot of the drug companies will have undertaken a number of randomized control trials on their potential drugs to see the benefit or effect of those drugs before they can then be licensed. So we're a long way off being able to say that outdoor swimming can cure whatever condition you're suggesting or is a treatment for. But we're starting along gathering the bits and bobs of information that we need to start to move towards having people take part in research trials.
I can see that could be really difficult to create these longitudinal studies, so many factors involved as well. But even just your collection of data now in certain individuals, I guess, spurs the field along, doesn't it?
Definitely, it's a starting point. It's not the be all and end all. It's definitely a starting point. All research projects have to start somewhere, and yes, it does take time and money for these projects to develop. Because what we're advocating is an exercise which is taken outdoors. We need to look for different funding avenues than drug companies would offer.
And so one of the studies you did that had lots of data, which I found really interesting, was looking at the minimum water temperature for marathon swimming. So tell me about that. What happened?
Someone's been doing their research, haven't they? So yes, we were asked by the governing body for swimming, so that's FINA, to develop some water temperature limits for the outdoor marathon swim. Primarily because they wanted to make sure that the scientific rationale behind that, the figures that they were using, was secure. And so that's why we undertook the test. And we had a number of volunteers come into the lab and repeatedly swim for approximately 2 hours. These guys were pretty well trained athletes, so they'd be swimming 10K in about 2 hours 15. So they're only just slower than say the elite athletes that might be doing it in 1 hour 50 or 2 hours. And we got them to progressively swim in colder and colder water until we had to keep pulling them out, and then we basically stopped, just to see what water temperature was safe for them to be swimming in and what the characteristics of the swimmers were, so that we could say what was a safe limit for the swimmers that would be swimming in elite marathon swimming events.
And what is the magic temperature?
That's a good point, and it's a good discussion point, because the tests that we undertook were on swimmers swimming in swimming costumes. And so the temperature that we're suggesting for that would be 18 to 20 degrees, primarily because the type of athlete that's involved in these very elite long distance races are exceptionally lean. So they're very, very similar to your elite pool swimmers. And that because they have virtually no body fat on them, they will cool very rapidly in water that outdoor swimmers may be quite comfortable in for very long periods of time. These guys are not people that swim the English Channel or any other ocean swim. These guys have much less body fat on them, and so they need to, in order to be safe and for athlete welfare, we need to have temperatures between 18 and 20 for them to be able to conduct their swim safely. Now, subsequently, FINA have decided, in order that they can compete in cooler water, that they should be wearing wetsuits. So that's the equivalent of adding extra insulation to the body.
Do you find a difference between male and female?
Now, the difference is primarily in body fatness, and so actually quite a depending on the event. Actually, men and women can't necessarily compete in terms of speed on equal terms. There are lots of fast female swimmers, but in terms of the fact that they're able to endure or do very long endurance swims, they can certainly compete on equal terms with men there. Primarily because women do tend to have more body fat naturally than males do. So actually, yeah, women are in a pretty good position to be able to undertake long distance open water swims.
I've often wondered that, whether there's some kind of crossover point, and we're talking elite athletes, we're not talking about me going out swimming, but if there's some crossover point where women actually become quicker, essentially because they can stay in the water for longer.
Yeah, and it primarily depends on the body fatness of the individual, and then the swimming speed and the heat production that they can produce. So there's a couple of factors that are really quite key. So it's how much heat can you produce, and also the insulation that you can that you have to retain that heat storage.
And so you've set up a podcast as well. I want to ask you about that, called Humans in Extremes. And so it's not just cold water that you're studying. You're talking about altitude. You're talking about all sorts of things. And the podcast I listened to was the one about altitude and Viagra treatment, which I thought was pretty interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. Tell me about your podcast and some of these different areas that you study and then communicate about.
So my podcast, it came really from the idea that we in the lab meet lots of really interesting people with some interesting queries, and our students don't necessarily get to see all of that. So I thought, well, how can we communicate to the students that we see these interesting people and we tell these interesting people the same things that our students perceive, we tell them perceive from our what they term boring lectures. And we give them exactly the same advice, yet they go and do these extraordinary things. So I really wanted to inspire my students to take more interest in the topic that they're studying, but also maybe to inspire a few to do some weird and wacky things, but do them safely. So that's where it kind of came from. And yeah, I've just really enjoyed chatting to people. So I chatted to Dr. Matt Wilkes about his career in medicine and his PhD, which he's been doing. And that's where the altitude and Viagra study came about, because he was actually working on Everest as part of a research group. And they were looking at ways to maintain skin blood flow. And one of the things that is used to maintain peripheral skin blood flow, or skin blood flow, skin blood flow, is to use Viagra. And that was the original use for Viagra before they realized that it had other effects. So yeah, we spent a good hour chatting, most of it not included in the final podcast, unfortunately, but most of it ended up on the cutting room floor. But yeah, it's been quite an eye-opener talking to different people. So I've talked about someone that walked the rabbit-proof fence, the entire length of it in the middle of the Australian summer. So you guys will know a bit more about it than I did. I've talked to ice swimmers as well, so people that regularly do ice miles. So they've been an extreme ice miles. Who else have I talked to? I've recently talked to a channel swimmer as well, and it's been an amazing experience. Oh yeah, talk to somebody that's run the Marathon des Sables and who's run an Arctic marathon as well. So these people are pretty extraordinary and they do some amazing things. But when you speak to them, they've really done their homework on the event, and so it's actually really interesting for my students to see that these guys have done quite a lot of homework and have learned about these extreme environments.
And I guess that's something that they've all got in common, is it? Because you'd have to be pretty single-minded, wouldn't you?
Bordering on stubborn, yes, you have to be exceptionally single-minded, very focused, I think is the word, and committed. That was probably the common thread throughout all of these podcasts, is the level of commitment that people have to their goal.
And this wasn't in the show notes, but Viagra probably wouldn't be very useful for cold water swimming, would it? If that thins your blood, I don't know. I was just trying to think it through as you were talking. You know, your blood's carrying your heat around, but maybe thin blood's not very useful for that.
Swimmers, in fact, if you're a cold water acclimatized, will actually start to move the skin blood flow to the center of the body more rapidly. So the vessels at the surface of the skin vasoconstrict more quickly. So it'd be an interesting study to do, but it wouldn't have any benefit because you're exactly right. You would if it did work, it would bring the blood closer to the surface of the skin and increase the rate of cooling as well.
Yeah. Warm water swimming, but that's not really a thing, so it might be good for, but I don't know.
There's some people would say that swimming in a swimming pool was warm water swimming.
I guess so. So it could be a performance-enhancing drug. Who knows? Well, it is, you know.
Heated water. I don't know whether it would be performance-enhancing, purely because when you're exercising, your muscles are normally well perfused with blood. So the exercising muscles would have a good skin, but would have a good blood flow. Actually, would be interesting to see if you were taking Viagra, would actually that blood flow be moved to the skin as opposed to the working muscle? That would be the interesting question.
Well, I look forward to your grant proposal. I think it'd be interesting.
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. There's probably a few other avenues to chase first, but you never know. And so you're an open water swimmer. Where did you swim this morning? What's on your agenda for the future? Are you do you swim every morning? Do you have events in mind? How do you think about swimming?
Well, swimming for me is my wake up. I really enjoy it. First thing in the morning. Um, I live in Portsmouth, near Portsmouth in the UK, and I'm lucky that I live very close within walking distance from a beach, so I can swim most mornings when it's conducive, when it's safe to do so. Really, so I'll go most mornings for a swim, about an hour long swim. Shorter if it's in cold water or really cold water. Um, so that's really what my swim's all about. Yeah, and I've kind of taken it to another level over the last few years. But I've really just gone from just enjoying the swimming to increasing my training. As I've got a little bit older, I've moved away from the team sports, which were causing me lots of injuries, and just gone back to doing more swimming, which I find doesn't have the same injury problems as I've had as team sport players. Um, so yeah, I've taken from being a competitive soccer and rugby player to being more being doing more training in the pool and outdoors. So that's really where my swimming's gone. So yeah, I've done quite a few swims in the UK. I swam the English Channel last year,
Oh wow.
and I've done some Channel relays as well as things like swimming around Jersey. We had hoped this year to swim what's called the North Channel and do that as a relay team, and that's between Northern Ireland and Scotland, and it's approximately the same distance as the English Channel, so around 21 miles, but rougher seas, colder water, and bigger jellyfish. But
Wow.
unfortunately, COVID hit and we weren't able to travel. So that's back on the cards for next year. And other than that, I've not made any further goals because I'd really like to get this one in the bag first.
But at least you've been able to keep your training up.
Yeah, that's been a real godsend, and for me, it's becoming important to have that routine and doing that exercise, which I don't have the same outlets for that I used to have. So I'm not in the same rugby teams or the same soccer teams anymore. So actually, the community that I'm in within outdoor swimming is becoming an important part of my social life.
Yeah, and certainly lower impact than rugby that you mentioned. That's probably a good
Yeah.
thing. You mentioned Portsmouth before, and I meant to ask you earlier. I think it was your PhD or some of your early work you were doing with Navy and life vests and naval exposure to cold water. What were the findings out of that?
Yeah, well, I used to work for the Institute of Naval Medicine when I was much younger, and we did a whole heap of work, ranging from fitness standards to the clothing that Navy personnel wore to check that it was safe for them to use. So there's lots and lots of research projects that we undertook around the work that sorry around the clothing that people needed to wear in order to stay safe. So it's primarily around that my research focused when with the military.
So what's next? Where do you see some of this work going?
Well, I really like to progress the work in swimming for mental health. I see this as an area that is massively under researched, and so we just like to continue along the track that we're on, trying to get to the level that that as I was talking about earlier, those randomized control trials, so that we can start to see if open water swimming has improvements to people's mental health, and get it on a par with some of the other research that's done with drug companies. I think that's really key in terms of sort of research. I'm keen that both the safety message gets across, and I'm keen that there's a balance as well. That there are always going to be there are always going to be safety issues with going into cold water, and that cold water swimming is not for everyone, and particularly people with cardiac conditions, with with those sorts of conditions. It's really important that if people do have conditions that like that they need to go to their doctor first to be checked out, to check that actually they can go swimming in very cold water before they go swimming. I think also the safety aspect is paramount, because we can't hope to find or hope to establish if open water swimming has any effect on mental health if we don't address the safety side. So making sure that people are safe when they go into cold water is absolutely key, and then the enjoyment can happen.
I've certainly noticed from afar that UK wild swimming seems to be called as a really big, seems to be on the increase. So there seems to be a lot of people in the UK and Northern Europe doing a lot of open water and outdoor swimming.
Yeah, I think it's the new park run.
Right.
And and it's great. It's good to see, because in general we're becoming a nation of couch potatoes, and so actually getting people to exercise is absolutely key. I think also getting people outdoors and taking care of their environment is absolutely key, and maintaining or actually improving their environment is key. But we're keen also to get that safety message across. Every year in the UK, we have between 400 and 600 deaths, water-related deaths every year. Half of those people do never intend to go into cold water. And so there's a general lack of understanding still, even though we are an island nation and all those things, there's still a lack of understanding and awareness of how to behave and act around cold water. And those that are expecting to go in may not have been either properly dressed, wearing life jackets, or aware of how powerful or how overwhelming cold water can be. So that I don't want to put a downer on anybody's enjoyment of being in cold water if they're doing so in a safe environment with people that have knowledge about how cold makes your body feel, and in benign-ish conditions where we're looking at a swim club going out for their swimming session with people looking out for each other. It's the unsafe swimming in water which is dangerous to swim in. And I'm really key that people become aware of where they should and shouldn't swim, and times they should and shouldn't swim.
So things like not swimming by yourself, being aware of the prevailing conditions that you're going into, the temperature, and how long you've been in the water as well, maybe wearing a watch or having some way of knowing how long you've been in there.
Absolutely. And I think also it's key that people recognize how they're going to get out before they get in. Yeah, it's just from the point of view that if you are having to climb out and you know that you've been in for a couple of hours and you're feeling pretty weak, have you got the physical strength to be able to climb up that ladder, or have you got the physical strength to get you out of the water? So making sure that you have a good exit before you get in is absolutely key.
Thank you very much to Dr. Heather Massey from the Extreme Environments Research Group at the University of Portsmouth for that fascinating chat. I really enjoyed that. If you'd like any more information on anything you've heard in this episode, if you'd like to get in touch with Heather, if you'd like to tune into a podcast, then get over to our website at www.thepodpodcast.net. That's www.thepodpodcast.net. And if you're interested in rating the show or leaving a comment on your podcast catcher of choice, then please feel free to do that too. Thanks again to Heather, and thanks again for listening in. My name's Mark West. I'll catch you next time on The Pod.